There are always a lot of ways to approach a single subject, and each teaching is its own particular way of approaching this subject, which broadly we could call spirituality. But in practical terms, what is it all about when we talk about spirituality, or the seeking process that starts in some people? So that's what I like to start with. It's how Ramesh used to tackle the problem, is by asking this question: what is it really all about? And more particularly, not really what is it about, but what are we as humans seeking in practical terms? And the answer that's given as a suggestion, it's a concept. The answer to this question, what are we really seeking, whether we realize it or not, is happiness for the human being in daily living. And this happiness, when it is there on a continuous, unbroken basis, is completely satisfying, meaning that the seeking, the movement outwards, the movement for something more stops. So really we're just looking for a way of being in life where we're not moving outward, we're not looking for something more. And we know that because when one particular thing is there, the seeking stops. So we're looking for happiness for Roger, in this case, in this life. And what is that in practical terms? Because if we just leave it at that, an answer, a word, happiness, then that's not really that helpful as part of this seeking, because it's not very defined. And that tends to be one of the problems with seeking, is that we don't necessarily have that much understanding about what it's all about. So happiness for the human being turns out to be something quite simple and ordinary, extraordinary at the same time. It turns out to be continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. When we find ourselves at peace, automatically at peace, meaning that peace is our default way of relating to life. Peace is the absence of needing things to be different, which means the absence of needing more than what is. And if we look at the movement outwards that is automatically happening, we find that the movement is for happiness. But the definition that seems to be in place is happiness, and happiness means outcomes in the future. So we find ourselves moving in life automatically and reacting to life in such a way that it can become clear when we observe this movement. It can become clear there must be a deeply ingrained belief already that says my happiness is to be found in circumstance, in outcomes, in life looking a particular way. And we can conclude this by watching the movement that is automatically looking for outcomes, for pleasure, and by seeing the reactions that happen internally when life unfolds out of line with our expectations, looking at the reaction that happens inside. And the reaction that happens inside is a reaction of resistance. And when we look at what that resistance is, it's saying, no, this is not how life should be, this is not what I need. And so we can conclude that this reaction must happen because there's a deeply ingrained belief that says, what I need is X, Y, and Z. So peace of mind actually turns out to be the absence of suffering. So happiness, which has been described as peace of mind regardless of circumstance, really means the absence of suffering regardless of circumstance. So it makes sense that we should look at what human suffering is. If this search is for the end of suffering, if what is delivered at some point is the end of suffering, then it makes sense that awareness should land on what suffering is. That's why this question is asked at the beginning. What are we really looking for? Because if we don't ask that question and come up with an answer, that is an answer, not an answer equivalent to are there Martians living on Mars, something that, is going to have to remain theoretical to us. So the question, what are we looking for? We get given a theoretical answer which is very practical. So we can start testing that for ourselves, asking ourselves, is it true that this is what I'm really looking for? So if we don't ask that question, then we can't jump to the next step. And the next step in the teaching is assuming that, and don't remain assuming. The point is to test it out for yourself. So everything delivered here is a set of concepts. And once the concepts are understood intellectually, the point is to follow the concept, see what it's asking us to see in daily life. So just to make this point, because it's a point that we can spend years listening to talks and listening to talks and not relating to them in the most healthy way. So anything that anyone has ever said is a concept. So imagine that I was to say that in 10 minutes you're going to be asked, what is on the table? So that question is going to be asked of you in 10 minutes. What is on the table? And that's understood by the person. Okay, I understand. The question is going to be asked of me, what is on the table? And then the answer comes. I give the person an answer. I say, an apple is on the table. It's a red apple. What seems to happen in life is that we're satisfied with receiving an answer. Once we receive an answer, sometimes we just say, thank you very much for that. Now I have the answer. And that's where it stops. And so then when the question is asked 10 minutes later, so what is on the table? Well, very quickly the answer comes, oh, an apple is on the table. But that's a dead answer. That's second-hand. That's something that you have just been told is the answer. You've been told that an apple is on the table. What if there's a dog on the table? Not an apple. Maybe there's an apple on the table, not a dog, but do you know the apple? Have you seen the apple? So the point of the pointers is for them to act as a guide for awareness to land on what is being pointed at in daily life, in daily living. It's all available to be seen for oneself. So the teaching is a set of concepts. There's hundreds of them. In the next 2 hours, there'll be at least 100, if not 200 or 300 concepts that are delivered. I've already delivered plenty. And so the skill and seeking actually is a skill. The intellect needs to become sharpened, especially in this field, which is the field of jnana yoga. Jnana yoga is the path of wisdom, and how it has been delivered over time is through someone who has realized what needs to be realized, delivering conceptual pointers. there's nothing to be given here. The truth can't be given. It can only be pointed at. So the concepts need to be related to correctly. And what really, really happens so much of the time is that the concepts are treated as truth. And when that mistake happens, that something that is heard is received as, oh, that could be true. That could be the truth. Then we make the mistake of mistaking the finger pointing at the moon for the moon. That's where that saying comes from. Don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon. Move your head upwards. Move your head towards the apple on the table. So happiness for the human being is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. Concept. That's what a concept is, a description. If I say, the apple is red, it's a concept. The car is beautiful. Concept. So, happiness for the human being is not to be found in the flow of life, but rather in our attitude to the flow of life. That's a concept. What does it really mean? So that means the concept needs to be understood intellectually first. Happiness for the human being is not to be found in the flow of life. The flow of life is always, only ever, pleasure or pain. Our happiness is not to be found in pleasure or pain, but our happiness turns out to be peace of mind. And peace of mind depends on our attitude to the flow of life. So suffering, which is the opposite of peace of mind is the end of suffering, in practical terms arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, anxiety and worry, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So those are the 5 labels, the 5 headings, broad headings, under which all human suffering can be categorized. Guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. This is important to know because now that we've asked the question, what am I really looking for? If I don't just believe that I'm looking for enlightenment, a word that actually I've been saying this is what I'm looking for, and for years maybe have no real idea what that practically means. And the idea that, or the belief that we have, enlightenment means oneness. So if the question is asked, so what is this enlightenment you're looking for? And then someone says, it's oneness, it's connection, it's being God, or it's oneness with God, oneness with everything. So that's just another answer that's come from a book, let's say. There could have been awakening experiences, profound experiences that in the experience demonstrates a oneness. And then the mind might say, that's it. That's enlightenment. What if it's not? So going back to suffering, which is what ends when continuous unbroken peace of mind is in place. And we find that suffering is arising in the form of guilt, blame and pride. That's the first 3 headings under which, in practical terms, the suffering which arises can be categorized. Guilt is an uncomfortableness with oneself for those actions that I have done that have delivered negative outcomes to myself or those people who I love, or even a stranger. So I do something, the outcome is not in line with what I would like, painful to the other, let's say, and therefore I hate myself. I feel guilt for not having been better, not having done it differently. Blame is a reaction to those actions that happen through the other, that deliver a negative outcome to myself or someone that I love, not in line with our expectations, and the attitude is, you hurt me, so I hate you. You haven't acted the way I would like you to act, so I hate you. And pride is a reaction to those actions that happen through me that deliver a positive outcome. And I relate to that as, look what I have achieved. And the basis of guilt, blame, and pride is all the same. The underlying linchpin on which those three relationships to life can happen is the belief in personal doership. The belief that I am the doer, the other is the doer of the actions that happen through them. Now this means it's an attitude towards, it's a way of seeing life. This notion of personal doership is referring to a way of seeing what happens through me and the other. It's a way of seeing what happens through me as my doing, which means really my choice to do exactly that. The choice of a separate, independent entity that's in complete control of everything they think, they feel, they say, they do. And that belief in personal doership is actually out of line with what is really happening in life. When we investigate what really is happening in life, we find that on closer investigation, this belief in a personal doer, the belief in an entity that is separate from everything else and can choose exactly what it does and how it acts, falls away, or at least is seen to be inaccurate. So this belief in personal doership is a way of seeing, it's an attitude towards what happens in the flow of life, particularly an attitude towards the actions that happen through me and the actions that happen through the other. So you might notice I'm saying the actions that happen through me, the actions that happen through the other, because actually what's being suggested is that that movement in life of everyone at any point in time is a movement of consciousness through the human form. It's much less my doing than I have thought. So it's very clear that the heart beats, but it's not my doing. That the liver cleanses and it's not my doing. So those functions are clearly seen as not my doing. So this is what doership points at. It's, if I believed that I was the one pumping the heart, then there would be a belief of personal doership towards the functioning of the heart. The speaking, on the other hand, or the thinking, we relate to very differently. The speaking usually and the thinking is something that we do have an attitude of personal doership towards. And is it that different to the functioning of the heart? Because if it is, or if it isn't different to the functioning of the heart, then what we can conclude very simply is I have a healthy attitude towards the functioning of the heart. I don't have an attitude of personal doership towards the functioning of the heart. I see it clearly as a happening, a biological movement, not my doing. Whereas my attitude to speaking and thinking is completely different to my attitude to the heart. My attitude to my speaking and my thinking and my actions is one of personal doership. What if they're not different? Then we can conclude I've got a completely inaccurate attitude towards my thinking, my speaking, my body movements. And I want to know if that's the case. The suggestion here is that the problem in life, the problem for the human, is suffering. This problem, I mean, relative to what the human is really seeking, the experience that the human is really looking for. And I say it's the experience the human is really looking for because when that experience is delivered, seeking stops. If that experience was delivered and seeking continued, then I'd say, well, obviously that's not what the human is really looking for. But when we see that the experience of continuous unbroken peace of mind is delivered and seeking stops, then we can conclude, that's what I'm really looking for. So if suffering is the problem, and it's said that the basis of the first 3 categories of suffering, the basis of that is the belief in personal doership. Guilt, blame and pride. I hate you for what you have done that has hurt me or my family. I hate you for what you did that didn't live up to my expectations of you. That is blame based on the idea that the person is the doer and that the person could have acted differently. And guilt is the same principle but in relation to one's own actions. I hate myself for what I did that didn't deliver the outcomes that I wanted. And I hate myself based on the idea I have that I am the doer, that I could have acted differently. And pride, those feelings of look what I have achieved, based on the same principle. I am the doer, I was in control of the outcome. I was in control of my actions that led to the outcome. So if we come to see today's coughing day. If we don't worry, it's not your doing. If we come to see these actions which we have always related to as my doing, if we come to see them as much less personal, then what happens is our involvement in life, our attitudinal involvement in life, starts to quieten down. So the biological involvement, the participation in life carries on. The body is going to do what it needs to do in the moment biologically. Then the outcomes are seen to be out of our control. The movements of the body in each moment are seen to be biological in nature, so they're allowed to continue to function. And attitudinally what has happened is there has been a letting go of insisting that things turn out a certain way. Now, the fact is that life from the beginning of time to the end of time has always been the same. There never has been a doer doing anything. Life has always been unfolding automatically. The attitude of doership has been there, claiming ownership and resisting life. But that attitude of doership, so let's go back to our attitude towards the functioning of the heart, and that's one that allows the heart, we're not concerned about what the heart is doing in each moment. We don't think about it and decide whether it's whether I'm functioning well or not. The attitude to one's actions is a different story. And if the belief in personal doership falls away, then the movement of life, which has always been the same, is allowed to carry on. without a resisting. So there never has been a doer. The fact that we've had an attitude of personal doership hasn't, even if we had an attitude towards the heart of that's my doing, it never would have made it my doing. And so this attitude that I am the doer has never made us the doer. It's just been an attitude that creates a reaction in life, a reaction towards what's happening, because we judge it as right or wrong based on the idea of personal doership. So if we see ourselves as the doer, we have to see the other as the doer. If we stop seeing ourselves as the doer, then we have to stop seeing the other as the doer. So this isn't just a belief that we go, oh, I believe now that I'm not the doer. It comes from investigating the actions as they happen moment after moment in such a way that we see, wow, I simply cannot be the doer. That's the insight that can happen at some point in time. After we've investigated life enough, the insight is, wow, I simply cannot be the doer. I've never been the doer. I never will be the doer. And when that insight is complete, then what falls away is the load of guilt and blame, the load of pride. It simply becomes, we then have a new way of relating to life, moment after moment after moment. The new way is not a new way of relating to life based on a belief I'm not the doer. It's simply the collapse of the old belief I am the doer. And then what's left is what naturally is there. So how do we come to see that we're not the doer? One approach, which is looking at life on a causal basis, is to see that a human being at any point in time is designed one way, the way they are in this moment. And a human being in each moment is based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. And we weren't in control of our genes, and we weren't in control of the up-to-date conditioning. That means the new conditioning that is delivered by life moment after moment after moment from the time we were conceived. So we weren't in control of our genetic structure, and we weren't in control of the family we were born to, the country we were born in, the political views of that country, the cultural, religious views, the school we went to, the friends we made, the events that happened day after day, the dog that attacked us, the shoutings that we received from our parents telling us we're doing this right or wrong. All of that, and the good, the praise, the fun times that you had playing with your friends, everything that happens moment after moment is life producing or delivering new conditioning. And that new conditioning adds on to the existing conditioning, and we can call the totality of the conditioning that exists at any point in time our up-to-date conditioning. And then new conditioning in life will have the effect of adding to or changing our up-to-date conditioning. And some new conditioning in life can radically alter our up-to-date conditioning. So the suggestion is that the belief in personal doership is part of our up-to-date conditioning. So the human being at any point in time is as they are as a result of two factors, their genes and up-to-date conditioning. So, you might not have remembered, I said there were going to be hundreds of concepts. And that's another one. I mean, basically everything I've been saying can be broken down into sets of concepts. So the human being as they are at any point in time is based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. Up-to-date conditioning is the totality of conditioning that life has delivered to us so far. Life delivers new conditioning in each moment. The new conditioning can change or add to the existing up-to-date conditioning, and some new conditioning can radically alter our up-to-date conditioning. Now, if we can find a third factor on top of genes and up-to-date conditioning that makes the human being as they are on a biological level, then this theory falls away. But if we look and see how we react to traffic in the street, for example, or react to the fact that the delivery order that we placed for some food comes and it's wrong, the suggestion is that the reaction is completely based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance we find ourselves in. So the circumstance we find ourselves is always going to be unique, and our reaction is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning that we had no control over. The belief is that there is a third factor. Well, actually the belief is that the first two factors are irrelevant in the equation, and there is this magic entity that is completely unconditioned, completely independent, and it chooses in each moment exactly how we, as we see ourselves, the body, reacts. It's my choice, it's my control. So that's the idea of doership. When we look closely, we find actually there's no such thing as this independent chooser, but rather there is the biology of the body based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so if an investigation of ourselves demonstrates for ourselves that this imagined independent entity that chooses is actually a set of mechanical processes, mechanics based on genes and up-to-date conditioning, then our up-to-date conditioning changes radically. And as this is seen more and more consistently, then the understanding goes deeper and deeper until eventually it uproots completely the old understanding, the misunderstanding about who we are, the doer, the misunderstanding that we are the doer. So this misunderstanding is not our doing, because there is no doer that has done anything. The misunderstanding is there because it was part of the story of life. It was there because it's part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning that we didn't control. And life put in place the misunderstanding. As a result of misunderstanding, suffering has to arise when life unfolds out of line of what we think we need. And when the misunderstanding falls away, which is life's doing, so life puts us in these situations. I'm sitting here, not my doing, but speaking is happening. So life has put you in a situation where life is delivering new conditioning. How that new conditioning affects your up-to-date conditioning is not in my control and not in your control. It will have an effect. The effect might be negligible, or it might be radical. But that's the description of how life brings about this change. By simply delivering new conditioning that alters our existing up-to-date conditioning. So the other half of the human suffering is worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And what that set of suffering is based on is the ingrained belief that not only am I the doer, but that I need pleasure, outcomes, to be a certain way in order for me to be complete, in order for my happiness to be there. So when we look at the combination, we find that the false idea of who we are is, I am the doer of everything that happens through me, the other is the doer that happens through them, and I need life to look like pleasure, 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 in order for me to be complete, in order for me to be happy. That, in summary, actually is the totality of the problem. If life would uproot that false set of beliefs totally right now, then what would be left is a clear seeing of what we are, because the false idea is not there. The false idea acts as a veil, covers up our true nature, prevents that seeing from being there right now. And at the same time as there being a complete seeing of what we are in essence, there would be the end of suffering, because the false belief, the false self-image would have been eradicated, and it's only the false self-image from which the suffering can arise. And because life tends not to eradicate it all in one foul swoop, what we find is there's a process of seeking, and the seeking tends to take a period of time. And if we're lucky over that period of time, it's this very belief in personal doership that gets eradicated. Now, it gets eradicated in very many different ways. We find ourselves, when seeking, reading all sorts of different things, being exposed to all sorts of different teachings. Many of them are radically different, and many of them are all profound in their own way. And what we find is insights and experiences happening that reveal things that we hadn't seen before. The insights and experiences tend to follow on from what it is that we're immersed in for a period of time. And once that insight or experience has happened, the process carries on. And whether we realize it or not, at the end of the process, or well into the process, if the process is really doing its job, what's really valuable is the reduction in suffering. And the reduction of suffering comes when our attitude to life starts to be one of witnessing life unfold, which really means watching it without being heavily attitudinally involved in it. And this can happen, and we sometimes aren't even aware of what has happened, because the process by which this has happened is maybe doesn't include some clear descriptions about what the problem is and what we're really looking for. And so we don't have to have a clear description. We don't have to have it put into simple, clear, everyday language, speaking about how this change looks practically speaking in everyday life. Very clearly, it doesn't have to happen that way, because a lot of teachings don't focus on this, and yet change happens. However, it makes sense that if it is put clearly and understood, that the seeking process, which is not our doing, may well follow on from that understanding. And it may well mean that the seeking actually starts to happen much quicker. So this isn't suggesting that now we have to start feeling guilty at the fact that we blame the other, for example. If that's how it's interpreted by the belief in personal doership, that here's a concept that happiness for the human being is the end of suffering. Suffering arises in the form of guilt, blame, and pride. So when blame arises, blaming the other for what they have done that has delivered pain, when that blame arises, the doer might say, oh, I shouldn't blame. Blame is my unhappiness. What I'm seeking for is the end of suffering. So I've failed. And that attitude to the blame is an attitude of guilt, which is more suffering on top of the blame. So if we can come to see that the blame happened because of our genes and up-to-date conditioning as it is in this moment, it's the way it is in this moment, not because of my doing, but because of life as it's unfolded up to now. And so if blame happens, the attitude that I've just described will allow blame to be there. We'll watch it as a happening, not my doing. Which means if that happens, the belief in personal doership is not being reinforced. As soon as guilt happens, the guilt is saying, I shouldn't be blaming in this moment. I should be different. I should be doing it in such a way where there is no blame. And that's reinforcing the belief in personal doership. Now, if that happens, we shouldn't feel guilty about the fact that we're feeling guilty about the blame. Because if we feel guilty about the fact we're feeling guilty about the blame, that's a third layer of suffering on top of the first two layers of suffering. But if that happens, it's a happening, according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So hopefully, at the layer behind that, there will be an understanding that this is all happening, not my doing. And as we find an understanding it's all happening on the very furthest back layer, that's something to rejoice, because that's the understanding it's all happening and not my doing coming into the picture. And as that's in the picture, it's dissolving by not reinforcing the belief. It's dissolving the belief I am the doer by not reinforcing the belief I am the doer.
It could be for everything. This example of blame and guilt, this it could be for everything, whatever arises inside.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that it is because of all this conditioning and genes.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever, it could be for everything then.
It is for everything, yes.
Whatever happens.
Whatever happens. Everything in life, from the beginning of time to the end of time, is a happening according to God's will. What that means, as I'm describing it, God's will is a description that's pointing at the fact that all of life is a creation. That consciousness at rest, the unmanifest, which we could call infinite creative potentiality, at some point has to manifest. It's its nature to manifest. It wouldn't be potentiality if it didn't manifest at some point. So at some point it manifests, and what it has manifested into is this story of life. And so God's will means what has manifested, what has been created. So God is not some entity out there separate from the manifestation. God in this description is consciousness or source, meaning the consciousness at rest, which is absolute nothing, at some point explodes into absolutely everything. And yeah.
I mean to like this understanding, what you said, what was the final, that guilt is also arising because of all conditionings and genes, and then there is some understanding that it's there, so it's not because it has nothing to do with me, it's all because of conditionings and genes. So that's understanding, it's third layer. So this could be understanding for everything, whatever is happening like inside us.
Yes.
Or for blame, guilt, fear, anything, sex, whatever arise.
Yeah, all of it is a biological arising based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. Whether our eyesight is good, whether what we like the taste of and what we don't like the taste of. This is what you're pointing at?
No? Means about this witnessing, the last third layer, which sees that this is blaming is also happening. It's okay because of some conditionings are there, genes, so it is arising. So then third layer is also which is witnessing or understanding. So it's good. I understood it. I mean, it's then it's for everything, whatever arise, not only blame or guilt. But whatever, I mean, like in biological or emotional level or in thinking, means this is for everything, means
I agree. Yes, spot on.
means
Yeah.
everything could be taken like this way, like this from the third layer. I mean,
From the third layer of seeing it as a happening.
yes,
Yes, for sure.
yeah.
In fact, the attitude is, as you said, maybe because I was focusing on suffering, made it sound like the attitude is towards suffering only. Actually, the attitude is towards all of life.
All of them, yes.
To the sunset, the attitude is, well, there'll be a biological reaction to the sunset that finds it beautiful, but on an attitudinal level, there's an understanding, this is as it is. My biological reaction to the sunset is as it is. And even my attitude is as it is, according to creation or my genes and up-to-date conditioning.
And this, to say it, feel it beautiful, it's also like something, it's also like the same way we should take it like a blame. We blame somebody and blame arises. And if some sunset arises and some beautiful feeling arises, so that should be also taken in this way, that okay, now it is arising, so it's...
Yeah, yeah, completely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Means like very beautiful things or very sufferings, anything.
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 Yeah, perfect. Okay. Spot on. Okay. All of it.
Okay.
So with that attitude, life is witnessed.
Okay.
The totality of life is witnessed. And yet, this is an attitudinal witnessing. So as you said, we are observing the movement of the body that way as well, not just the blame. And so that means the body can continue to participate fully.
Yeah. Yes.
So this witnessing doesn't mean that the body then withdraws from life.
Yes.
Actually, we allow the body to, with that attitude, the body really is, let's see what it does.
Yeah, I understood a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I know it's not my doing, I'm not the doer, but if the body starts to gather weight, and it's gathering weight, and I'm eating the same, but I'm so happy, I'm not stressed, so, but I'd not like for it to gather so much weight. But I'm not the doer. So, what's to do? What's to be done? Go jogging, but I'm not the doer. Dieting, but not the doer.
So if
nothing to do.
If jogging happens, so the attitude "I'm not the doer" isn't meant to get in the way of jogging happening. If the feeling "I want to go jogging" arises, then the body might go jogging. And then that can be witnessed as a happening, not your doing.
Yeah, but jogging is painful, and I am the doer because I'm really jogging. So it's not just happening, I'm working at it like hell.
But why?
Because it's work.
But why do you want to do it?
So because I want to lose some weight.
So you do want to lose weight?
Of course I do.
Okay. But at the beginning you said you didn't.
Well, I would like the body to not gather weight, that's what I said. But I'm not the doer is what I have to say.
No, you see, so once again, this is not meant to become a new belief. I am not the doer, like some mantra. I am not the doer is a concept that is pointing at the mechanics of life. So what is being suggested is for us to see that the mechanics of life are a particular way. For us to really see it. Which means we really have to look at it and ask ourselves, So if the mind comes up and says, no, I am the doer, right? If we've investigated for ourselves and come up with the conclusion that, wow, everything that I do during the day is based on these two factors, then the understanding is your own understanding. And then the mind saying, I am the doer, we can see as just being a defiant mind based on a lack of intelligence, right? So once the intellect and awareness really land on what's what, then for a while there can be this old habit in place that says, I am the doer, and looks at what is happening as it's doing. But it won't last for long if it's really been seen for yourself. But if it hasn't been seen for yourself, if you're just saying, I'm not the doer because Roger said I'm not the doer.
I'm saying there are certain activities that go well beyond, they require a force. There is this beautiful, peaceful flow of life happening, and then there is a force required in certain activities, which somehow does reinforce the doership.
Well, so a lot of the time, someone would ask, if I drop my attachment to outcomes, because that's what the other half of suffering is, where we believe that my happiness is dependent on outcomes, my happiness is dependent on pleasure, my happiness is dependent on circumstance. There are three ways of saying the same thing: outcomes, circumstance, pleasure, or pleasure and pain. And the ultimate belief is my happiness is dependent on love, being loved. Someone would say, if that falls away, if that belief, that attachment to outcome falls away, then where is my motivation going to come from in life? What is going to drive me through life if I have no attachment to outcomes, no attachment to circumstance? And the answer is that when that attitudinal mistake falls away, the mistake of seeing myself as the doer and seeing the other as the doer and seeing my happiness dependent on outcomes, when that falls away, the biological makeup is still left. So the genes and up-to-date conditioning still remain in place. What has happened is a particular part of up-to-date conditioning, a particular part has fallen away. But the body is still there with its genetic makeup and its remaining up-to-date conditioning. And that body is a biological reaction that will react to the circumstance at hand. And the body will have its biological preferences in each moment. And so the biological preferences are what will then dictate how the body moves in life. But those biological preferences are different to the attitudinal attachment to outcomes. So the body will have a preference for whatever its biological preferences are. For example, a preference for health. And so it will move towards health, but without being attached to the outcome. If it's moving towards health and it is insistent on health being there, or physical appearance being a certain way, then that movement is coming from the attachment to outcomes, the doer. But if that falls away, we'll find that it's possible that you can still go running, because the preference is to have a certain body, which could include even the physical aspects of the body. Why not? If I can do it, why not have a haircut or something that makes me look the way I like? Knowing that you can go and get your haircut and they could totally mess it up. Or it could be totally out of line with what you would like. Knowing that you could go jogging with the aim of losing weight and you fall and break your leg and you end up putting on an extra 20 kilos.
Thank you.
So this is the difference between the movement in life based on an attachment to outcomes, that where we feel, I have to do this because I have to have this outcome. And that doesn't magically mean that we'll get what we want. In fact, when we go into life with that attitude, we just as often don't get what we want. In fact, more so, we don't get what we want with that attitude, in my experience, more so than when we surrender and allow the body to move according to its biological preferences. There's much more intelligence in the body's movement according to its natural biological preferences than the combination of the biological preferences plus the ignorance, in a sense, the ignorance of doership. So the ignorance of doership actually tends to mess up the natural intelligence, the natural flow.
So what would be the natural flow of the biological preferences?
It would be dependent on the biological preferences. So the natural flow of biological preferences is to move towards the preference without an attachment to the outcome. So often there is this mistaken idea that I will suddenly have no preferences. All my preferences will fall away. When I'm not attached to outcomes, my preferences magically will fall away, which is not at all the case. If your attachment falls away and you're at a party and someone comes around with a plate of food and there are plain biscuits that you don't really like and really nice chocolate cake, your biological preference might be for the chocolate cake. And at that point, the hand is not going to not know where to go because it has no preferences. Yeah, you're not going to need to toss a coin to decide which to pick. The hand will move in the direction of the biological preference. And if it just turns out that someone else also sees the plate with the chocolate cake and they get to the chocolate cake before you, then it's understood that it was destiny for your biological preference not to be fulfilled. And there won't be hatred towards the other for having taken away your happiness. What the other has done is played their role as part of destiny at bringing about a situation where your preference wasn't fulfilled, which means pain in the moment relative to the pleasure in the moment. And the healthy attitude to life will be to see life exactly as it is, a story unfolding, which is, it was my destiny not to get the chocolate cake. The other attitude is, hey, I saw that chocolate cake before you did, and that it's mine. Give it back. Or someone will sit quietly and, I hate you for taking that chocolate cake.
The biological preference is to not go jogging. It's to stay on the couch. And something makes me uncomfortable and then I go jogging. So is that guilt that's making me go jogging? Or because the preference is clearly not to go?
Well, with the belief in personal doership in place, guilt and blame and pride and attachment to outcomes are going to pervade you.
Correct.
Life
But
all the time.
Agreed.
So guilt will be a big reason for jogging happening.
So what happens if there is guilt has become quite less and still there's a biological preference to be on the couch? Then what is it that makes the person go jogging without guilt?
It would mean that the amount of weight that is being gained gets to a point where it's further and further out of line with the biological preferences, which means more and more painful. No suffering at that point, just pain. And at a certain point, the pain of the weight gain might be less than the pain of the jogging. And if that's the case, then your choice will be the feeling will be to go jogging.
And there will be no guilt involved.
If the belief in personal doership has fallen away, there can't be any guilt.
Related to what you were saying before, I guess that if the attachment to outcomes ends, then what you might realize is that your preferences change, because your prior preferences were not really your biological makeup, but they were more based on attachment to outcomes, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we have a certain, if exactly as you said, if there's a certain attachment to outcomes, then what we're driven to do in life might be based on a psychological preference, you could say. Well, actually, based on psychology, the attachment to outcome. And when that attachment falls away, we might realize, wow, if I just do what I feel like doing, I don't at all want to keep doing what I did yesterday, which comes to the example that I think we spoke of yesterday, where at some point we realized that going out late at night and socializing with a certain group of people is no longer appealing, whereas it used to be. And it becomes unappealing either because our biological preferences have changed, or it can become less appealing because we suddenly realize that what I thought I was going to get out of that situation is not as valuable as I previously saw. And so, yeah, the psychological attachment to that falls away. Remember, when I talk about this, it sort of seems like really easy that, oh well, my attitude to the flow of life is all here in my head, and it's very easy for the thought, I'm not the doer, based on a clear seeing, to come and cut it off. Actually, the belief in personal doership, the belief in my happiness being found in outcomes, is deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in the body, based on events that have been happening our whole life and a certain attitude to events that have been happening our whole life, especially ones happening when we were very young. Or we can even introduce this notion of events, very traumatic events happening in past lives or this life. And somehow the memories, the unresolved attitude from another life, not necessarily my life, but a life that somehow is linked to now, that they can be part of the body's makeup. And so that's why what we find is we go out into daily living and the reaction of suffering is sort of just explodes in us, and there's no question of seeing it differently in that moment. We can't sort of try and apply non-doership to this this explosion in the body of hatred or something like that. So in a way, we can start to look at that as a biological reaction. That explosion in the body is a biological reaction. Even if we can see that at its core it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. But it's so deeply ingrained that it creates this explosion in the body. And there's nothing to be done about it in that moment. Where it can get cut off, or what can get cut off, is the bits that are functioning on the level of thinking. The guilt, the blame, the pride, the expectation in the future. The bit that is just continually going on and on and on like a story in your head. That's what can get cut off when the concepts start to arise. So if awareness lands on the fact that we're strategizing about how to make something happen in the future, and let's say you've got a business and you want to win a certain account, you can strategize as to how to make that happen. And that's just good business planning, let's say. When the strategy and the thinking about it become obsessive, whereby we are thinking about it and the thinking clearly isn't going to help. We've done what we need to do in terms of planning, And now we are thinking about it and worrying about it, or thinking about the outcome and imagining what our life is going to be like if we get this new client, what it's going to mean for us. Then when we see that thinking happening, that's no longer practical thinking about what needs to be thought about. That becomes suffering. And when awareness lands on the fact that there's this expectation and attachment to outcomes, the thought can arise, my happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. So this outcome, this winning a new client, is part of the flow of life. It's going to be pleasure or pain. Losing the client is part of the flow of life, pleasure or pain. And our attachment, all of the thinking, is based on the belief that that outcome is actually going to make me complete, that my happiness is dependent on that outcome. And so in an instant when awareness lands on it and realizes that that's actually my suffering, that's what keeps me disconnected from myself, disconnected from presence, which is where the essence of the human being is, and where my peace and my happiness are really to be found. This thinking is based on a false idea of who I am and what I need. So the concept, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, comes up and cuts off the thinking. And then we find ourselves, back here again. Good. I forgot for a while. And inevitably, it'll start up again for as long as the beliefs are deeply ingrained. And each time awareness lands on that thinking and the thought, my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure, that thought arises and cuts it off, and we come back. And as that thinking gets less and less and less and less, because we're now no longer reinforcing it, no longer reinforcing the belief that is the source of that thinking. We're not reinforcing it because actually the opposite concept is coming up and cutting it off. As that gets shorter and shorter, what it's really doing is dissolving the belief in personal doership, and at some point we'll find that this explosion in the body, which for a while we might as well just treat as a biological reaction, that we don't even look at in relation to doership or suffering. It's no point. At some point we'll find that starts to get less and less and less, because the root of doership is being dissolved by awareness landing on the obsessive thinking patterns on the level of the conscious thinking. So we can combine this with a resting in being as a practice, but hopefully awareness lands on what I'm calling a practice and realizes, it's not even a practice, it's a happening. So abiding in I am is just something that will happen, like everything else happens, based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if we hear that there is a field of being, which is where we really find ourselves, where we know ourselves, there's a field of being and it's always here. And the flow of life happens after that being. That at any point we can drop into being and we find, here I am. And that field of being is outside of thinking. That field is never going to be able to be accessed through thinking. Knowing myself is never going to be something that can be done by me thinking about who I am. We drop into this field of being and we be what we are. And the thinking that keeps us out of this field of being is a thinking that has been happening obsessively for our whole lifetime. And when we look at the thinking that's obsessively happening, we find it is guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation, and attachment to outcomes. So as that thinking becomes seen as basically an error, a mistake about life, and it starts to stop, because that thinking is the activity that keeps us out from resting in being. It's a thinking that is looking for answers out there, looking for happiness out there. It's a thinking that is always looking at the theoretical past and the theoretical future. So it keeps attention outward all the time instead of inward. And what inward really means is right here, now. We only find ourselves here, now. And here and now means outside of the thinking about there, past and future, what I need. So as we become aware more and more that thinking is an error, it can get cut off more and more rapidly, meaning that awareness lands on it, and now the intellect understands that it's an error. The intellect understands that it's not taking us where the intellect thought it was taking us. So that thinking is the intellect, it's just the unintelligent part of the intellect. And the intelligent part of the intellect recognizes that there's an unintelligent part of the intellect that remains in place because it's not seen to be unintelligent, not seen to be based on a mistake. And so once the intelligent part of the intellect recognizes this, the intelligent part of the intellect intervenes and cuts off the unintelligent part of the intellect. And as that happens more and more, where we find ourselves is in this field of being. So it's a place where we come to know ourselves directly. We'd come to know a self that is very different to the self we have believed. So really, this is the crux of it, is that our true nature, our true being, is something that is complete in every moment. It's satisfied with itself, and because it's satisfied with itself as it is, there is peace. And what it contrasts, so it's always there, what's hijacked the show in a sense, is a set of thinking that looks at the body and says, that is what I am. So it's thought that has become convinced that I am the body and I am the thinking. I am the emotions and the feeling, including the suffering. It's a set of thinking that has an idea of who it is, what it needs, and it's continually unhappy or in resistance to these outward things, which is not at all what it is. And so if we drop into being and find, oh, there I am, and there's no problem with who I am, that being, that dropping into being is cutting off the thinking that says what I am is actually all of these things that I'm not really. So it's from here that the body can start getting old, let's say, and malfunctioning, which it does. It malfunctions even when we're not old. If we can keep dropping into this place of being, then those changes that happen on that level out there are no longer as relevant as they are when this thought says, I am malfunctioning, then I'm not up to standard. When the thought is there that relates to what we're not, as though we're that, then the thought is an uncomfortableness with oneself. Because it's not really who we are, so it has to be uncomfortable. And so when we find this part inside, which is the self, and it reveals itself to always be self-content, at peace with itself, then you can imagine the body can be dying, and as long as there's a connection to the self that doesn't die, that doesn't become broken, it isn't broken, so if we are being that, then even on our deathbed, we're complete. And so that movement back can start to become more regular, and as we rest there more and more, we actually become more and more familiar with ourself, until such time as we find ourselves always grounded there, always in contact with that. And at that point, I guess we could say there isn't a forgetting about who I am. And from that place, outcomes are not so important. Biologically, they're still important. So biologically, the body is still going to have its preferences, and the outcomes are going to be in line with the body's preferences or not. But the attitude now is to understand that the flow of life is something that is unfolding as it's destined to unfold, that the amount of pleasure or pain that the body receives is part of that story. It's already determined effectively, that whatever happens in each moment is part of the story. And so attitudinally, we're not so concerned with what is happening. And if we didn't have this connection to self, then even if we knew that life was destined to unfold exactly the way it unfolds, then it would just be, we'd still be, I guess we wouldn't be at peace on a deep level. We'd be able to be at peace where we go, oh, well, not what to do, nothing to do. But there's a deeper peace than that available. The deeper peace than that is to actually be connected to the self that is always complete. But that connection to self doesn't deliver some amazing experience that is, like a wonderful bliss that we can't explain. Connection to self is peace, the absence of suffering. It's true that there are experiences that will come out of that when they happen, we can know they appear to be an expression of our true nature, a flowering of our true nature. So unconditional love or bliss, or even a strong feeling of peace, which is very different to the very, very subtle contentment and absence of suffering. We can have a very strong feeling of peace. When those happen, they're enjoyed, they're appreciated. There'll be an awe around them because they feel awesome. But hopefully it's understood that they're not what's meant to be there for the rest of our life 24/7. If we have an experience of bliss or an experience of joy or love that's profound, then often what the sense of personal doership does, because it wants pleasure, it thinks its happiness is pleasure, it says, oh, that's it. Finally, I've found the thing that satisfies me, this bliss, this experience of bliss, which is deep pleasure. Can you imagine if you get bliss? After a while, the deepest of bliss will become normal. It's only blissful when it's contrasted to, let's say, what normal is. So if our answer was complete bliss, intellectually at some point we might realize, no, it can't be that, because bliss would become normal. It wouldn't be bliss anymore. And so maybe we can drop this idea that our happiness or enlightenment is a state of a particular experience. It's more the absence of suffering, which means continuous, unbroken peace of mind. It does come from a continuous recognition of our connection to Source, recognition that we've never been disconnected from Source, that what Roger is, what every human being is impersonal consciousness of Source, connected to a particular body vehicle, functioning through that body vehicle as personal consciousness. So Roger really is the personal consciousness experience, with or without suffering, depending on whether the body has the belief in personal doership or whether the belief in personal doership has been eradicated by life. And when the belief in personal doership is eradicated, it's recognized, oh, whatever happens through the body has to be a functioning of Source. Which means if Source wasn't functioning through me, nothing would be happening through me. So if something is happening through me, including just a very simple experience of life, that means that Source is functioning through me. So that means there's a continuous recognition. If the belief in personal doership has fallen away, continuous recognition of my connection to Source. And the junction point where impersonal consciousness becomes personal consciousness, that junction point we can call the heart, not the physical heart, but home, or the heart, the spiritual heart, let's say. And resting there, that's where it becomes clear, I am. And resting in that I am is what I've been speaking about for the last 20 minutes. Resting in our being that knows for itself that everything's okay. That's what I am is really saying. I exist, and what we find in that existence is it's a complete existence, like nothing is needed, nothing's missing.
This connection to myself is something I'm really longing for, but I don't understand then on the same time, how can it be that I'm often like running away from me, and I kind of forget it again.
Mm-hmm. That's the story of life, actually, is a story of forgetting oneself. So consciousness at rest has exploded into the story of life. The story of life is a story of evolution, a story of time and space, a story of cause and effect. So that means that on the surface, it's all of those things. Time and space came into existence when consciousness at rest became this. And we can look at it and say, yes, it's a story of evolution. There's biological evolution, there's technological evolution, spiritual evolution. And we can also say it's a story of forgetting what we are, suffering as a result, longing, a deep longing, intuitive knowing that this is not what I am, that drives us in a certain direction. And at some point there's a remembering of who we are. And then that remembering leads to the end of suffering. In between the forgetting and the remembering, there is a movement between remembering and forgetting, and then remembering, forgetting, remembering, forgetting. That's the movement whereby this path between head and heart gets strengthened. And as it gets strengthened more and more, we find that the remembering lasts longer and the forgetting lasts a shorter amount of time. And when it's seen, when we have insights, it's often seen fully. It's like, wow. And then it's very surprising that what was seen just sort of fades away. And we forget what was really seen, or when we drop into being, it happens. We don't do it so much, it just happens. And then if we find ourselves out again, then we try to go back into being and we find, oh, it's not working. Why can't I go back there? Because it's not really our doing. It's part of the story unfolding. And so it is a story of remembering and forgetting. Remembering and forgetting. And so the movement from forgetting back into remembering is part of life unfolding. So if we see that suffering comes to an end, when it comes to an end, not because I've done something to bring it to an end, there might have been the thought that said, go for a run, that helps. And you go for a run, sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. When it does help, we can feel, oh, I brought it to an end because I went running. But if we can start to recognize that the thought, the impulse to go for a run appeared, and then you might find the motivation to go for a run was there, and so you went running. But if the thought appeared, go for a run, and there was no motivation to go for a run, you might not go for a run. Sometimes the thought will appear, go for a run, the motivation to go for a run will be there, you go for a run and it doesn't help. So once we start to see that actually the outcome never in my control, sometimes I get what I want, sometimes I don't get what I want, and even the thought and the motivation to do something not in my control, and so that in itself means a witnessing of life unfolding. And the irony is that it's this witnessing of life unfolding which really means a deeper and deeper understanding. I am not the doer. It's that brings about the remembering. That is the remembering. The forgetting is I am the doer. The forgetting is I am the body in control. And so as this remembering happens, it happens in the form of really seeing that even, my efforts are not so much my efforts, but are happening. So having the longing is a good sign in itself, because life includes the longing as part of the movement from forgetting to remembering. And hopefully some of what we talk about here becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning, which means at least it can exist alongside the deeply ingrained beliefs that keep us disconnected. And then as it goes deeper and deeper, it not only becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning, but it starts to uproot the existing misunderstandings. And then automatically we find, wow, I remember, which is not so much I remember, but the forgetting has fallen away. And it's like, oh, so there's more and more peace. So it's a bit of a process. See, so even the thinking that is thinking about how sad it is, let's say, that I forget, that's the problem, right? That's suffering. And if the thought can arise, meaning if it's seen that the movement is towards feeling sad about the fact that there's suffering, and realizing that that is more suffering, then a stepping back out of that thinking, stepping back out of that thinking into being, and it is inspired by the thought that says even this is is keeping me out of what's available right now. Because even though I say it's a process, at some point the process reveals that there is no process. The process reveals that I've always been this, and there's just been a veil. And the veil is, in part, thinking that there is a process, thinking that I need to get somewhere, thinking I need to go somewhere and do something. And at some point it's like, dropping in right here and finding, oh, of course, it's always here, it's always now.
And this connection to yourself or the being, what helps to get every day there?
It can be the doer that's asking that question. How can I do it? And then hopefully we realize, that's like, how do I get there? Rather than the awareness that, no, that thinking is the problem. But having said that, there is also a good answer to that question. So it's a good question because it can inspire some words that can become part of the up-to-date conditioning that can bring about change. But we also have to point out that it could be the doer, or it probably is the doer asking, how do I do it? So at the same time as delivering the words that can become part of the new conditioning, or part of your up-to-date conditioning, there are also the words that caution about where the question is coming from. So that we can see, is it the doer, is it the thinking that says I need to get somewhere and do something to make it happen, is that still in place? Because if it is, then we just stop. And there it is. So how can stopping happen? And so this is life delivering new conditioning that can affect our up-to-date conditioning, which means that what is suggested here then can happen automatically. So what is suggested here is definitely not saying do this tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning. But rather it's saying that the words might become part of your up-to-date conditioning. As you're walking through the day, you might just find certain thoughts arising based on the circumstance, and the thought automatically arises. And if you can witness that, if you can see that that's what's actually happening, that in a particular circumstance, the circumstance triggers part of your up-to-date conditioning, and a thought arises. And so what I'm suggesting here is that when awareness lands on the thinking that is obsessively happening in the head and sees it as guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation. So a lot of how can I do this? Why hasn't it happened yet? A lot of that is in this area here of expectation, right? And maybe guilt even. Why haven't I been able to do it? I'm not good enough. I'm not understanding this. So when awareness lands on that sort of thinking and sees that it's the thing that is in the way of being, and understands, because we've been talking about it, that thinking is never getting us where the thinking thinks it's going to get us. The thinking thinks it's helpful, but actually it's a pain in the ass, and it's not helpful. So when awareness lands on this, the intellect kicks in and understands that thinking can stop in an instant and nothing is lost. Actually, everything is gained by that thinking stopping. And so all of that understanding that I've just mentioned here about understanding that the thinking is pointless, more than pointless, it's detrimental, comes up in the form of the thought I am. So I am contains all of that understanding. And so the thought I am, which spontaneously arises once awareness lands on the obsessive thinking, that thought I am cuts off the thinking. You don't have to say I am and try and cut off the thinking. If that's how it's happening, the doer is trying to do the exercise and it's not effective. But if awareness just lands on the thinking and the thought automatically comes up, I am, it can become the bookend to the thinking that's happening. The bookend means that's the end, it cuts it. And at the same time as it cutting, we drop into being. And now, how can we drop into being? Because we understand, we hear that the center of consciousness that functions out of the head so much, actually its home is in the heart. So if we allow the center of consciousness just to drift down into the heart, like visualize it drifting down into the heart, it's already harder for thinking to happen once this center of consciousness drifts into the heart. And then if we open our field of vision so that we have a wide, a soft gaze, not focused on anything in particular, and we realize, wow, the whole visual field arises in my field of awareness. So we don't need anything to be different. It's just a witnessing of what is in this moment. And that field of vision, then we can notice, includes the field of all the senses. It's a field of awareness in which all of the sense objects arise. And so this combination of allowing the center of consciousness to drift into the heart, together with an open gaze that allows everything to be as it is, means that we're resting in being much more than when we're focused in the head. So how this all comes together is awareness lands on the obsessive thinking. The thought I am arises, which includes all the understanding that that thinking is not helpful. The I am becomes the bookend for that obsessive thinking. And we drop into the heart with an open gaze and just rest there for as long as we find ourselves there. Feeling that in that instant of dropping into the heart, the suffering, the involvement with circumstance stops. The circumstance stays more or less the same. Nothing has changed. Life hasn't got better or worse. And all the suffering about how terrible life is drops away when we drop into being. And it's like, now this is sanity, let's say, and the other is insanity. But not saying it in a way where we're, the ones making life insane. That's just the story of life. That it's a story whereby this attitude to life is one that is quite insane for a period of time. But we're not the doers of that. No one is failing because we have this out of line attitude to life. And the realization when we drop in here, this is how I really am. This quietness with life. And as that happens more and more often, because we might find we stay there for about half a second before we're dragged back out into the insanity again. And we can be in the insanity for 10 minutes or 3 hours before we realize, before awareness lands on the fact that the thinking is going again. And so after 10 minutes or 3 hours, we'll realize, when did I come back into this? I was resting in being, obviously for a very short period of time, because I didn't even register it, maybe. And I'm back into thinking. And that's not a problem. I am arises again. And we drop into being. So if you drop into being 10 times in a day for half a second each time, compared to never in the last 10 years, it's pretty good. And what we find is if this practice, which is not really a practice, is just happening because of our genes and up-to-date conditioning having changed, if this starts happening and we keep finding ourselves dropping into being, what happens is the amount of time we rest there can become 5 seconds instead of half a second. And 5 seconds, we can start to register our true nature. the essence of the human being. And then 5 seconds turns into 3 minutes. And 3 minutes can turn into half an hour. And it doesn't have to happen in a week. If it moves from never being done to 10 times in a day for half a second each, that's good. And then if it becomes 3 seconds after a week instead of half a second, that's good. And on it goes until we find this connection that we're always there. It no longer makes sense. When I say make sense, the beliefs that used to be there that drag us out into this other zone, they dissolve. And then we find ourselves resting in a place that for a while, it felt like an effort to go back to. It only felt like an effort because there are these false beliefs there. Once the false beliefs dissolve, we find, actually this is my home. It's always been my home. I just got a bit sidetracked.
Yeah, with this, let's take this example, first 3 seconds, then 1 minute, 10 minutes. So it's always increasing. In my personal experience, I have been once in my life in a very nice position, whatever, let's say 1 hour or whatever, and then it was decreasing again. So and this is also something I just can't understand. How could I ever go away from? Do you know this? I mean, am I the only one going?
No, I'm sure you're not. That's this process. So even if you drop in there for 10 seconds, then you get dragged out of it until you go back into it again. And so, you had a peak experience if you felt it for an hour, right? It's a peak experience that just happens. And that peak experience often is much more dramatic than what I'm talking about, this being. It reveals, it's a lot more profound and mystical. And so the peak experiences are great because they reveal something, but sometimes we don't see what they're revealing and we just get carried away with the experience. And then we crave the experience. We wait for it to come back again. We think that's the answer because in that experience there was peace, no doubt. But maybe peace can be delivered in a different form to that peak experience. In fact, the suggestion here is that happiness for the human being is not a peak experience. And that if we are craving after a peak experience that we had before, then that craving after it, feeling like, why has it gone away? That craving is the suffering. So my experience with Ramesh was that I had some very profound, I was having a lot of profound oneness experiences and esoteric experiences, all of which seemed exactly like the books describe, like wisdom teachings describe. And that's because the peak experience are revealing aspects of our true nature and aspects of the essence and the nature of life experience. And so it's bound to be that those peak experiences are in line with what is written about this revelation. And when I described it to Ramesh, he said, Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience. And now, clearly, the experience was more than just an experience. It had something to show. It was part of the change that was happening. But what he was getting at, and where he was very right, is actually don't relate to it as anything more than what it was. And it served its purpose, let's say. So now, forget it. It was just an experience. Because it's your attitude that is holding on to it and wanting it to come back and insisting that that's what enlightenment is. It's all of that that is wrong. So let go of it. It took me months to believe what he said, to realize what he said was accurate. Because The first, I described it to him one time in a lot of detail, describing the profundity of the experience, that subject-object relationship fell away. I wasn't the body. Everything is arising inside what I am. And it was it was a very profound experience, which I was convinced wasn't an experience. Actually, I was convinced it was reality. This was it. I was waking up from my delusion, and this was reality. And so I described it to him, and he said, at the end of the description, "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." And I thought I had described it quite well, but obviously not, because I said he doesn't understand what I just said. So I described it again, and trying to fill in any gaps I might have left, which I didn't think I left any gaps. I thought I did a very good job explaining. And again, his answer was, "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." And I'd flown all the way from Australia to Mumbai to have this discussion. And so one more time, I thought I'd try and, and the third time, "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." And so conclusion was, well, it wasn't just an experience. Actually, this was the end of experience. This was reality. And so I went back to Australia, and I'd walk in the morning along the same path, waiting for the same thing to happen at the same place, and it didn't happen again. And at some point I realized that my thinking about it and my waiting for my understanding to be at a point where it happened once and for all, that was my suffering. And that's when, because I was very clear on what suffering was, when awareness landed on the fact that my expectation, my ideas about what it was, were my suffering. That's the point when it clicked. I said, what if he's right? What if it was just an experience? And it all made sense then, because I saw my error of not treating it like just an experience was creating new suffering. And then it clicked. Could it be? It was just an experience. I realized for 3 months I didn't believe it until that moment when it clicked. And when it clicked, the thought was, because I was very clear on the teaching is saying what we're looking for is continuous, unbroken peace of mind in daily living. And that experience included continuous, unbroken peace of mind in an extreme way, because in that experience the thought arose, if someone came along with a machete and hacked off arms and things, it wouldn't be touching who I am in the slightest little bit. And so obviously there was peace, because nothing was a problem. And so that was my conclusion, that peace of mind in daily living exists when I know myself as that. And in this moment, what if he's right? And the teaching came, what we're looking for is continuous, unbroken peace of mind in daily living. And I thought, what if, like he's saying, continuous, unbroken peace of mind is available not only in a oneness experience. In fact, continuous, unbroken peace of mind is available as living as Roger, experiencing yourself as a separate, independent, experiencing yourself as an individual, experiencing myself as this that is sitting on the couch, not myself as everything. Very specifically, I feel like I get up to go to the sink and get a glass of water. And so that is the experience that remains. I didn't think it was. I thought that experience of me suddenly gets obliterated, not there anymore. And then so peace is available as this. And I was discounting that. I was saying peace is available as a oneness experience. So once it clicked, then more peace, less suffering. And so the same with suffering. If there is suffering in our life, somewhere, if a witnessing of the suffering comes in and says, it's a happening, that witnessing in that moment creates a connection. It doesn't necessarily get rid of the uncomfortableness. It doesn't necessarily get rid of the suffering. But it creates some acceptance of the suffering. And that is welcome, that relief. It's not a complete end of suffering, but it means that the suffering is there, and there's a part of us that just is at peace with the suffering as it is. Not all the way through down to the, just the part of us that is at peace up to the suffering. The suffering, obviously, is not peace. But that bit of us that is at peace with the suffering is a big improvement to when there is suffering and there is no peace with the suffering. That's where we need to start with, is just the little bit of peace with the suffering, if the suffering is present in our life. So today's post that I put up, I put a post up every day. Today's was relax. It's not as important as you think. And that hopefully is just going to inspire a stopping of, on some layer, of maybe the thinking that is completely convinced that the suffering needs to end, or that I need this, or the other person needs to be a certain way. So relax, it's not as important as you think. Can create just a little bit of space, or it can cut really deeply into a complete stopping. So, if there's no other questions, we can bring it to an end for today. Thank you.